Okay, everyone. Hello and welcome to this edition of PON Live from the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School. My name is Nicole Bryant. I'm the managing director here at the program on negotiation, and it is 12 o'clock in sunny Cambridge, Massachusetts. So officially time to start our event, although I can see that so many of us are coming in from all over the world in the chat, and certainly it might not be noon for you. So I will say good afternoon, but I know that it could be also good morning or good evening. As many of you know, for over 40 years now, the program on negotiation has led the world on research and curriculum development, and also executive education trainings related to the fields not only of negotiation, but also mediation and conflict resolution. And we are delighted as ever to bring information to our community of scholars and practitioners and friends through this series of live events. So this is our summer version. This is for many of us, school has concluded and we are in between holidays, and we are in for a great event today. But before I introduce it, let me just say a welcome to all of our participants who are coming in and cover a few ground rules for how this event will proceed. So we have an hour to be together today. For the majority of that time, we'll have a presentation by our speaker, David Hoffman, who I'll introduce in just a second, for about 40 minutes. Of course, at that time, if you have any comments related to the material, please feel free to enter them into the chat. I will just remind you that ground rules indicate that please keep your comments on the topic that we are talking about today. If you have ideas for other sessions, we are always happy to hear them, and reminder to always be respectful and civil in the comments that we see in the chat. It's a great privilege to be able to interact with one another, but we need to always do that in a very respectful manner. This session is being recorded, so if you have to jump off partway through, if you want to let a friend know about it, it will be posted to the PON website in just a couple of days. And you will, as ever, be able to access our incredible video library of past events there. I'd like to say a big thanks to the PON staff who does so much work getting this up and running. Diane Long, our events coordinator, Lindsay Sullivan, program assistant. They are wonderful in everything that they're doing and will be regularly answering questions in the chat, putting information throughout today. And with that, my last introduction, and certainly not least, is of course to today's speaker, David Hoffman, who is the John H. Watson Jr. Lecturer on Law here at Harvard Law School. He is a faculty member with the program on negotiation, as well as with the law school, and a founding member of the Boston Law Collaborative. David is a beloved member of our community, and I am so excited to keep learning from him today. So with that, I hand over the virtual Zoom microphone, and I will be back for the question and answer portion. Already, if you do have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A function. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And Nicole and your team have been fabulous to work with, as always. I so appreciate the invitation to be here. I also want to say a thank you to participants who sent in stories about the power of questions in mediation and negotiation. And I'm hoping we have a chance to touch on some of those. I'm going to start by covering our agenda, which consists of stories, theory, practice, and some conclusions. And for each of these, you can see there's a question, as there should be in a program about questions. But what is our goal? Our goal for this workshop is to make it one of our superpowers to ask effective and, when needed, transformative questions. And you can see in this New Yorker cartoon, your screens may not be big enough to see the caption, which I'll read. One kid says to the other, "I still don't have all the answers, but I'm beginning to ask the right questions." And so hopefully, as mediators, as negotiators, that will be one of our superpowers. I want to acknowledge the Massachusetts people, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. This is a land acknowledgement that appears on the Harvard University website. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. If you want to know more about the Massachusetts people, Wikipedia has a wonderful article, but there are, of course, other resources as well. And if you want to know more about land acknowledgements and why they're important, the Smithsonian has a website devoted to this topic. I also want to acknowledge here at Harvard Law School another debt, which is, and this is a boulder that lies at the heart of the Harvard Law School campus. It was placed there after a protest some years ago about racism. And the plaque on this boulder says that it's placed here in honor of the enslaved whose labor created wealth that made possible the founding of Harvard Law School. May we pursue the highest ideals of law and justice in their memory. And so we will come back to the theme of diversity and social justice issues in this discussion today, but I want to begin with those two acknowledgements. On the art of asking questions, here are a couple of quotes. Actually, I'm going to give you 3 quotes. The first one is from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And it speaks to the reluctance that we sometimes feel about asking questions. She writes, "If you don't understand, ask questions. If you're uncomfortable about asking questions, say you're uncomfortable about asking questions, and then ask anyway." Or this wonderful quote by the physicist Richard Feynman: "Knowledge is having the right answers. Intelligence is asking the right questions. Wisdom is knowing when to ask the right questions." And we will focus on that question of timing. Now, I want to share with you finally, in terms of quotes, a very enigmatic comment that I heard from a very experienced mediator and arbitrator when I was just beginning my work as a mediator. He said, "When I first started arbitrating and mediating, I asked lots of questions in the arbitrations and I made a lot of statements in the mediations. It got me into a lot of trouble." Then he said, "Now, when I'm in an arbitration, I only make statements. And when I'm mediating, all I do is ask questions. That works much better." So I'm going to leave you with that enigmatic comment. It may seem obvious what this person was getting at. Maybe it'll be clearer by the time we get to the end of our talk. I do believe that mediation can be the art of asking questions. And I think that negotiation can be the art of asking questions as well. I'm going to tell you 4 stories. The first 3 of these stories come from my experience. The 4th story comes from the experience of a fellow mediator and one of my teachers. So, and the first 2 stories are about negotiation. The second 2 are about mediation. So let's talk about Sally Soprano. Now, many of you know that Sally Soprano is one of the most popular negotiation exercises published by the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. And it involves an opera singer named Sally Soprano, who hasn't had a lead opera role for a couple of years, and the Lyric Opera Company, which just lost their lead soprano for a show that is performing in 3 weeks. So I gave this exercise to the brand new associates when I was working at a firm in Boston called Hill and Barlow. Part of my job, once I became a senior associate or a partner there, was to help out with the training. And I used this exercise. So all the associates negotiated Sally Soprano. Now, one of the features is that there's a ZOPA, there's a zone of possible agreement on salary, and there are other issues that could be negotiated as well. But at least on the salary, you can scale how did people do. The Lyric Opera, of course, would prefer to pay as little as possible because it's a nonprofit and they have their own financial difficulties. And Sally would like to get as much money as possible. Where on the scale between 25,000 and 45,000 is a deal going to happen? So there are 2 negotiators, Sally's agent and the Lyric Opera business manager in this role play. And so we had 2 rounds. First, the associate attorneys paired up, negotiated the case. Then I brought in two senior partners to do a demonstration. And the associates got to watch some really good negotiators, and so did I. I learned so much from this. It was like an experiment. And what I found was that there was a winning strategy. And I'm going to tell you what the winning strategy was. I'm making up the partner's name here, but let's call her Claudia. And she was representing the Lyric Opera. What was her winning strategy? She got the best deal for the Lyric Opera of any partner at Hill and Barlow. She asked questions. She said, well, when was Sally's last role? How much was she paid? Would some kind of incentive comp be okay? With question after question, after she had heard the answers, she made an offer that Sally Soprano thought met her interests, her future goals, and all of her concerns. And so I asked myself, what are the takeaways from this experiment? And one of them was that for the partners who spent their time, not literally pounding the table, but you know what I mean, being assertive, questions were demonstrably better than assertions in this negotiation because they helped ascertain the alternative to a negotiated agreement and information on which a principled negotiation outcome could be achieved. The attitude that Claudia communicated was, we want to come up with a deal that meets your client's needs and goals, which is a very powerful message. And I want to share this quote from the recently published book by Bill Urey, the book Possible, which I highly recommend, by the way. He said, effective negotiators are persuasive listeners. They listen more than they talk. And I thought that captured the lesson for me of Sally Soprano at Hill and Barlow. My second story is about my late wife, Beth. She died 10 years ago. I've since remarried, but she was a clinical social worker. And in her first job interview as a clinical social worker, she was responding to a job posting where this entry-level job was offering $40,000 to $45,000 a year. And she had the interview, and they called her back. It went to voicemail, and the voicemail message said, we'd like to offer you the job at $40,000 a year. So Beth was she was wondering, how should I respond? And she decided that she wanted to ask them, is $40,000 the best you can do on the salary? So she said to me, I'm a little concerned that if I'm too pushy about this, they'll withdraw the offer. So I said, well, how do you want to handle it? What if they come back at, say, 42.5? And she said, well, I don't know. I've got an idea. So I'm going to show you what Beth did, which was a really interesting strategy and worked really well. So she got on the phone. She reached the executive director and asked, is 40 the best you can do? And the executive director said right away, we can make it 42.5. Are you able to start forthwith? And then Beth deployed her strategy, which was, a question. What would you be looking for in someone that you paid $45,000? Now came the feared silence. And Beth thought, oh no, they're going to withdraw the offer. Now, the silence probably only lasted about 2 or 3 seconds, but for her, it felt like several minutes. And then finally, the executive director said, you're a really good negotiator. We can start you at $45,000. And she was so relieved. She accepted the job and had a very good experience there. So what are some of the takeaways from this experience? So I think that one of the big takeaways is using questions to direct the focus of negotiation. Notice how the executive director did it. He sort of took the meet in the middle idea as taking it for granted and saying, focusing on when can you start? And Beth refocused the conversation with her question on, instead of meeting in the middle, why don't we see if we can come up with a way to match the offer to my experience? And that turned out to be a successful strategy. Third story, this is a mediation. And it's a case I was involved in. It involved a whistleblower, an employee who had been working for a large corporation, complained frequently about ethics violations. Those were investigated. It turned out there weren't any violations, and they put him on notice. They warned him ultimately, and he kept making these complaints, so they fired him. So in the mediation, he was bringing a claim of wrongful dismissal based on violation of public policy. The mediation, after a good long time, we were kind of at an impasse. And so I'm meeting separately with the employee and his lawyer. And I noticed on his resume, there was a mention of his having served in the US Army. And feeling kind of stuck, I just was kind of searching for more data about him. And I said, what was it like in the military? And I was really surprised by his response. He got, he told me in a very glowing way how wonderful it was to serve in the military. He said, in the military, everybody turned square corners. We knew the rules and we followed them because someone's life could depend on it. And he said, I got into the, after 20 years, I retired and qualified for pension and went into the private sector. And it seems like anything goes. And as he was talking about his experience and how much he liked the military and how much he disliked the private sector, I saw the light bulb, the proverbial light bulb, go on over his head. And he said to me, no, I think I wound up in the wrong place. And with that, we were able to settle the case because it was no longer for him as much an issue of principle as an issue of he was in the wrong place. So one of the takeaways here is that effective questions don't need to have a specific agenda. Curiosity and compassion may suffice. Fourth and final story, and then we'll get to some theory and practice questions. So this is about an indignant teacher, and the story is told by my friend and my teacher, fellow mediator Ken Cloak, and it's about a teacher. He made up the name for the story, Rose. Rose was a veteran teacher and then became the head of the union local. So she'd been out of teaching for a bunch of years. And after she stepped down as head of the local, she came back to teach in the school and found herself in a lot of trouble and found herself in a very tense situation and was about to be fired because of a major verbal outburst that she had had involving fellow teachers and students using world-class swear words in front of this large group of people. And the school sent a few of these teachers and Rose to mediation. And in the mediation, Ken reports, they were just hurling accusations at each other, pointing the finger of blame, raising their voices. And finally, Ken interrupted Rose mid-sentence, got very close to the edge of her personal space, and said quietly, "Can I ask you a question?" And she said, yes. And he said, "Has anyone ever thanked you for what you've done for this school?" And with that, her mouth dropped open and she immediately burst into tears and started sobbing uncontrollably. I'm quoting from the story that Ken wrote about this case. I turned to the other teachers and asked if they would each turn to Rose, tell her one thing that she had contributed to the school, and thank her for having done it. Now they all started crying. And as they told their stories of Rose's dedication to the teachers and the school, their accusativeness, her defensiveness, and the atmosphere of impasse were completely transformed. So Ken was feeling very relieved. And he said to Rose, "Are we done?" And then she said, "No." And he got a little nervous. And she said, "I need to apologize to all of the other teachers." And then the other teachers in the mediation room said, "We're coming with you." And with that, they visited the other teachers, and Rose apologized. And the teachers apologized for not having supported Rose when she came back to teaching after all those years. And there's a link, you'll see it in the chat for this story if you want to read the full-length version of it. But this wonderful transformative moment occurred because Ken asked this transformative question. has anyone ever thanked you for what you've done for the school? And so I asked Ken, what inspired you to ask that impactful question in the midst of all the recrimination? And he said, I felt inside myself the place where she was stuck and the question I would most want to be asked if I were her. And so that's where the role of compassion and empathy comes in thinking about the art of asking questions. So what are our takeaways? Well, one of the takeaways, it seems to me, is that questions can cut through our defenses and open our hearts and also our minds. So, theory, why are questions so powerful? So one of them is they enable us to direct the conversation. Now, here in this New Yorker cartoon, the caption is a little small. The judge is saying to the witness, when the court questions a witness, the witness is not permitted to reply. Let's not go there. Now, of course, mediators aren't judges, but our questions can shape the direction of a conversation. And I also think about one of the great question askers of all time, the fictional character Lieutenant Columbo, played by Peter Falk. Many of us mediators admire Lieutenant Columbo because he always had just one more question. And the people that he asked felt obliged to answer it, because if they didn't, then they would be, it would seem suspect in some way. So we have to avoid putting people in a nervous spot, but we also sometimes have to ask hard questions, but we need to do it with grace, as Lieutenant Columbo did. Another reason why questions are so powerful is they empower the recipient. Everybody likes empowerment, right? And when we hand people a question, we are giving them the opportunity, especially if it's an open-ended question. Open-ended questions give people a lot of possibilities for how they want to answer it. Leading questions are the ones that lawyers ask in cross-examination, and they don't give the person being asked the question any room to go anywhere. Mr. or Ms. Witness, isn't it true that on such and such a date you entered the intersection when the light had already turned red? There's only one answer to that question. I mean, there are two, there's yes or no. But if it's no, then you know the lawyer is going to impeach you with your deposition testimony or a videotape of the intersection or something like that. So leading questions we don't tend to use in mediation or negotiation because they don't give people any room. They are disempowering. In fact, they actually represent testimony by the questioner, which is something I learned in trial advocacy workshop as a law student. Finally, there are closed-ended questions, clarifying questions that are not leading questions. So someone tells us something, we say, I'm wondering, was it on this date or that date? You're simply trying to get a fact. You're not trying to elicit an admission. Questions are powerful because they create the experience of being seen and feeling heard. And I think the story of Rose that Ken Cloak told is a really good example of that. Questions are powerful because they can invite a narrative. And as Ursula Le Guin tells us, the story is one of the most basic tools invented by the human mind for fostering understanding. And that's why, following Ursula Le Guin's advice, I began this conversation today with some stories. Stories can be very evocative. Of course, we want to hear the stories of people we're negotiating with and people we're mediating with. Questions can confirm our understanding. A very common question for mediators to ask is, what I'm hearing you say is X. Am I getting that right? And of course, you have to ask that, am I getting that right, with humility, because maybe we aren't, and maybe they want to expand on their answer. Questions can broaden the scope of topics or narrow them. They can help us dig deeper or move the conversation up a level. Questions show respect and can show empathy, and they can foster relationship and connection and thereby influence. So I want to double click on this fostering relationship, because it seems to me that is the question I ask myself when I'm about to ask someone a question, not only in mediation negotiation, but in life in general. How is this question going to impact the relationship I have with this person? Are they going to feel more a sense of connection or feel a little threatened, perhaps, by the question? The questions can also reveal what the questioner cares about. In this cartoon, also from the New Yorker. The doctor says to the patient, I'm going to ask you a series of scary questions. When I'm done, let's see if you can guess why I'm asking. That unfortunately is an experience probably many of us have had when doctors ask us a lot of questions. But here's one that I think is more serious and less humorous. And it's about a 12-year-old girl named Emma coming home and telling her mother about a magnificent house that she had just visited. So Emma moved with her family to a new neighborhood, became friends with a girl who invited her home to play. It must have been quite a fancy place, for an impressionable Emma came rushing home to tell her mother about the silver and the furniture, the wonder of it all. When she finally paused in her excitement, her mother, the author's great-grandmother, had only one comment, a single question that said everything about what she thought was important. She said, but Emma, did they have books? And the author, Marilee Goldberg, of this wonderful book, The Art of the Question, says that question told her so much about what her family cared about, as opposed to wealth, learning. And some other reasons why questions are so powerful. They validate the other person's autonomy. I'm going to share with you a piece of, I know there are a lot of people in this Zoom space who aren't from the United States, but even those who aren't may know about the presidential contest between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan back in 1980. There was a presidential debate, and Ronald Reagan was neck and neck with Carter. But after this debate, the polling shifted and Reagan won the election by a very healthy margin. And people, the political scientists said the thing that helped Reagan the most was posing a question to the audience of the debate. He said, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Carter was the incumbent, and Reagan was running against Carter, who was seeking a second term of 4 years. Now, here in the US, we have a presidential debate coming up in 3 days. I suspect we're going to hear this question asked again. And the idea here is, and I think what political scientists realize, is that questions create a different brain space for us. It engages us differently than an assertion. Than if Reagan had said, I think you were not better off than you were 4 years ago. The question was much more effective. So here are some ideas about how this works in practice. And let me start with some empirical data from a study about the performance of management teams. And you'll see a link in the chat to this piece of research. What this research showed is that when you measure team performance, high-performing teams, medium, and low, based on the profitability of the team, and then you look at how people relate to each other in the teams that had a high ratio of inquiry to advocacy, in this case 1.1 to 1, there was at least one question asked for every assertion in this team, did much, much better than the low-performing teams, where the ratio was the other direction, 20 to 1, 20 assertions for each question. We also see this in the study of couples and couples counseling. The Gottman Institute, one of the leading institutes that studies this, found that asking questions is an extremely powerful intervention in terms of couples staying together. And I credit my wife, as I said, I've remarried my wife, Leslie Warner, who taught me about the Gottman Institute and all the wonderful lessons there, including the art of asking questions, which I try to practice in my own marriage, and I know Leslie does too. So if asking questions is so terrific, why isn't it done more? And what are some of the obstacles? Well, one, especially in negotiation and mediation, is the fear of judgment. We're afraid that maybe it seems like a dumb question, or maybe it's already been addressed. We fear losing control. Maybe people think that asking a question undermines our position of authority. Maybe there are cultural norms that inhibit the asking of questions. Sometimes there may be a hierarchy. We'll talk about that in terms of power relationships in a minute, that cause us to not ask in certain situations. And maybe there's a lack of receptivity on the part of the person that we're talking to. How do we overcome those obstacles? Well, one is to name the concern, as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said. Second is to be humble, to not have a lot of attachment to whether the question is going to be answered or how it's going to be answered, and really bring genuine, non-judgmental curiosity to the asking of the question, including compassion for the person and their situation, trying to create this atmosphere of safety and trust, and finally, apologizing when we goof. It is inevitable when we ask questions that we may step on someone's toe inadvertently, and we should be very ready to apologize. The big takeaway for me, as I've been reading, studying, and practicing in this area, is the central role of emotion in how people react to the questions that we ask. And it's not a surprise. Jonah Lehrer, in his book, How We Decide, is all over this, and explaining how neurotransmitters and the emotions that that we experience as a result of neurotransmitters actually represent the bulk of how we decide things. And these emotions come up in mediation negotiation in a variety of ways. One is managing intense emotion. So, for example, when the teachers and Rose were bickering and accusing each other, part of Ken's job was to manage that emotion and call a truce by interrupting. The second thing that he did was he elicited emotion. He was able to create a space where he could find out what the emotion was that lay behind Rose's defensiveness and accusativeness. When we ask our questions, however, we have to avoid triggering emotional minefields. We have to make sure that we're doing very effective listening. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about how to ask the hard questions. But let's talk about how we can, some tools for managing intense emotion. So one of the people I've learned a lot from over the years, Bill Eddy, he's a mediator, lawyer, and clinical social worker, has written a whole bunch of useful books. One of them is titled, So What's Your Proposal? And Bill recommends that when people are bickering, fighting, arguing, that we roll out this question. We can do it in a gentle, non-confrontational way. Say, I hear you're very upset about the situation. So I'm really curious, what's your proposal? And this is a very effective strategy for reasons that Daniel Kahneman explains in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Now, Kahneman and Bill Eddy weren't really talking to each other in these two books, but I think that Kahneman's book, which talks about system 1 thinking and system 2 thinking, fast, emotional, intuitive thinking, system 1, that's when people are bickering and arguing usually. And system 2, which is logical, what Bill Eddy's question does is it gets people to engage with system 2. You can't make a proposal without engaging system 2. Now, I'll tell you a quick story where I used this approach. There was a doctor who was a very generous philanthropic doctor who had created a foundation in a field that, in which he had done research. Over the years, the foundation had grown, had many employees, big staff. He was semi-retired, but he was creating a lot of trouble within the foundation, and they voted him off the island. They tried to do it gracefully, but ultimately they said, you got to go. And he was furious. And I said, well, what do you really want? He said, I want the executive director to be fired. And I said, I've talked with them. I don't think that's going to happen. They've made a very substantial monetary offer. And I said, I have an idea. How would you feel about making a T-chart on a piece of paper with the advantages and disadvantages of accepting this very substantial offer? And even he thought it was substantial. And so he made the T-chart and he picked up the pen to start writing the advantages and disadvantages. And he said, I get it. The logical thing for me to do is to accept this offer, isn't it? And I said, that's really your call, but I understand what you're saying. Eliciting emotion, as in Rose's case, we have to consider the context for the question. So the kind of question that Ken asked, has anyone ever thanked you for what you've done for the school? Sometimes we want to ask that question in a caucus session, or a joint session. And I think some mediators don't like to caucus. Others use caucus extensively. I think there are a lot of advantages to asking that kind of up close and personal question first in a caucus. But Ken, who one of his books is called Mediating Dangerously, did what I think is a courageous thing and asked that question in mixed company. But we have to think when we're eliciting emotion about other things. Who's asking? When is it asked? How much trust have we established already? And what might be the impact on the other people in the room? In terms of avoiding emotional minefields, I think the big question for me that I ask myself when I'm about to ask a question is, what wary and defensive parts might I be triggering by the question that I ask? Will people feel they're being judged or blamed? Is my questions accusatory in some way? Will they be embarrassed by the question because it's very personal? Am I violating some boundaries perhaps with my question? Does my question suggest that I'm taking sides? And we have to be very careful. People are hyper vigilant when we're in mediation to the mediator taking sides. And this quote from one of my teachers, Mike Elkin, I think is really apt. He says, in conflict situations, our protective parts see ambiguous stimuli as a threat unless conclusively proven otherwise. And so we have to go out of our way to make sure that we are not threatening people with our questions. And so good intent is vital, but it's not enough. We have to consider the impact. And for a really good role play exercise, it's actually a role play exercise. It's a question exercise on crafting effective questions. I refer you to Susan Podzibu, who's created a wonderful exercise on this. See her website link on the screen, and you'll have it in the chat as well, because the exercise enables us to see and hear from people how our questions are impacting them. Now, I want to talk about the art of listening. Now, if you Google, quote, the art of listening, you're going to find a ton of books. There's a huge library on this subject. In order to be effective question askers, we have to be very effective listeners. And Ken Cloak has done a YouTube talk called The Art of Asking Questions. And right at the heart of his talk is some discussion about the art of listening. And I highly recommend it. He talks about how what we're listening for is a whole series of things: facts, interpretations, subjective experiences, roles, intentions, emotions, interests, dreams, fears, etc. If you listen to people long enough, we can hear all of those things. And the reason we're able to hear those things is because we're paying attention both to the words and the music. The communication impact that we have and others have on us is a combination of body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, choice of words. In this New Yorker cartoon, the mediator says to the king, you say off with her head, but what I'm hearing is, I feel neglected. So this was a mediator who was listening to the music as well as the words. I want to talk a little bit about how we listen and our active listening styles, because that's obviously a bedrock of mediation negotiation training, that we should be active listeners. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean that we loop everything that we hear? Or does it mean that we respond to what we hear with a thoughtful question? And I find that I tend more in the question direction, and some mediators tend more in the looping direction. Both are important and both are useful. Some people talk in sentences, some people talk in paragraphs, and some people talk in page length discussion. And if they talk in sentences, it's easier to loop them. If they talk in paragraphs or pages, sometimes we have to wait until they're done and then ask a question that demonstrates that we've heard them. So in other words, we have to match the dialogue style. And we also have to pay attention to the role of intuition in what we're hearing, how we're hearing it, and be mindful that sometimes silence, a little bit, a moment of silence, can be a very powerful way of demonstrating to somebody that we not only heard them, but it had an impact on us. Final thought about the art of listening, and I'll get to some specific questions that I think might be worth considering. And this is from a friend, neighbor, and someone I've learned a lot from, Jennifer Cohn. She says, pay attention to what are we listening to, what are we listening for, and where are we listening from? In other words, what's our orientation as we listen to the answers to the questions that we've posed? Now, one of the kinds of hard questions that we ask in mediations, and they can be asked in negotiation as well, has to do with understanding each side's BATNA or MALATNA. So perhaps most of you know the term BATNA from getting to yes, best alternative negotiated agreement. In conflict resolution, we often talk about MALATNA. What's the most likely alternative to negotiated agreement in a case that's going to go to court if it's not settled? So those kinds of reality testing questions might be like, if the case doesn't settle, what do you see as the strengths and weaknesses for each side in court? And sometimes this is a question you might want to ask in a caucus session because people may want to respond privately about it. Or what are the likely costs of litigation, or the impact on relationships, or the likely impact on your life? We want to avoid becoming the enemy. And so I often will say, if I think there's a particular issue that hasn't been addressed, I'm imagining myself on your side of the table and wondering how I would handle the blank issue, let's say statute of limitations issue, or contributory negligence issue. Is that issue a concern for you? And if not, why not? If it is, I'm curious how you see it playing out. Sometimes coaching the negotiation, when people make a proposal and they say they're about to communicate it, sometimes we have to ask them a hard question, like, what do you think the other side's response might be to your proposal? And sometimes they realize that the response might not be very good and they're willing to reconsider. Regarding apology, people often say that can be a powerful intervention in mediation. Absolutely. I ask, if you could rewind the video, and I ask this in private caucus session, but you could do it in joint, is there anything you would do differently? Regarding diversity issues, what are some things that it would be useful for me to know about you and this conflict in order to be helpful here? If there are identity issues or there are difference of identity between the mediator and the parties, counsel. Regarding distributive bargaining, I never ask people, what's your bottom line? Except maybe if they've got one foot on the elevator and they're about to leave. How far in your direction do you think the other side might be willing to go? Turns out to be a much more fruitful question. A few caveats. Questions are not the only tools in our toolbox. Reframing, stories, metaphors, brainstorming, options, all of these are really powerful tools. And of course, there are dozens of others. Also, curiosity can put us in tension with emotional and cultural boundaries. Questions can connect us or divide us. So if you feel hesitant to ask a question, ask permission. We want to avoid doing any harm with our questions. We also have to take into account diversity factors and power imbalances. After all, the kind of question that you might ask if you are the employee or the tenant or the insured or consumer, patient, student might be different from the question that you would ask if you're on the other side of that equation. And regarding differences of race and gender, class, religion, ethnicity, disability, age, LGBTQ plus identity, and other factors, all of those may impact the kind of questions that we feel are okay to ask, and also impact how our questions are heard. Legal representation. Are there lawyers in the room? Are there some questions that are okay for lawyers to ask because of their role? And also, does the presence of lawyers change the focus of what we're talking about and maybe even inhibit the asking of questions? So here are my conclusions, and then we're going to go to Q&A. So the first one is, as you're thinking about asking a question, ask yourself, what's our purpose in asking the question? And in the early stage, think about how will this question enhance the relationship as opposed to maybe create obstacles or trigger emotional minefields. Second, consider the context. Where are we in the negotiation? How much trust has been established? Who's in the room? What it might be the emotional impact of the question. And that may have to do with eliciting emotion or managing emotion. Humility is a touchstone here. be ready to apologize. Our questions can get us in trouble. And if they do, we have to take a step back, apologize. When we ask the hard questions, the reality testing questions, we need to do it in a mindful way. And finally, compassion and curiosity will get us a long way in the art of asking questions. And so I close with this comment. As you use your superpower of asking effective, transformative questions, may the force be with you. And with that, I'm going to stop my screen share and hand the baton, Nicole Bryant, to you to see if we have questions in the Q&A.
Oh, how can I possibly speak after the Star Wars reference, David? That's a very difficult setup. But a big thanks to you. I am someone who is going to try to exercise that superpower in a more thoughtful manner. And I can see from the chat and from the Q&A that lots of people agree. I will say one general note, we have put it in the chat, but yes, this session is being recorded, and yes, the PowerPoint will be shared. So you need to stay tuned back to the event page where both of those things will be up in just a few days. All right, we have questions, many in the Q&A and more coming in, so I'm going to do my best. I will certainly not get to all of them, but you do have David Hoffman's email address if you want to continue to engage with him on this important topic. So we have a question from Jim, which is, David, when you're going into a mediation or negotiation, do you have your questions planned out in advance? I imagine some of them are spontaneous, but is there some kind of mix of that as you think through this?
Yes, great question. Thank you. Absolutely. Particularly if I have a lot of data. Sometimes you go into mediation, you don't have a lot of background, but in cases where extensive briefs have been submitted, I often have a lot of questions, informational, but also sometimes legal questions, reality testing questions, and I jot them down. And one of the mistakes that I've made is that I'll sometimes begin in talking with people saying, well, I've got a lot of questions here, but before we get to my questions, I want to hear if you have questions for each other, or if you have comments or responses to each other's memos. They don't want to go there. They want to know what my questions are, because they have brought someone new into the situation, and they are very, very curious from this new kid on the block. What are the things that stood out to me? And so they want to interpret my questions as kind of my judgment about who has the stronger arguments. So now I keep them on my pad, I keep them handy, but I don't announce in advance, oh yeah, I've got a bunch of questions, unless I feel like there's some factual things that just need to be put out on the table from the beginning. Because people are likely to interpret reality testing questions as pointing the finger toward a certain result, I want to hold off on those until I've established a little more relationship, connection, and trust.
Great. Lovely. We have one technical question, which is, some people wanted to know more about looping. David, if you could just clarify that for folks who aren't familiar with that terminology.
Yeah, so I first learned this term from Gary Friedman and Bob Mnookin, with whom I've done some trainings. And basically, someone says something and you respond. So what I'm hearing you say is X. Did I get that right? And the loop part is asking them to confirm whether I got it right or I didn't. One of the very powerful tools that mediators sometimes use, and negotiators can use it too, is cross-looping, where you ask the parties to say to the other person what they heard, and then ask the other person, did I get that right? But that's after you establish a little more trust. People are a little wary about doing that sort of thing at the beginning.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And we do have some questions that are from folks who are obviously considering careers or beginnings in negotiation and mediation and are interested in getting into that field more. So I'm going to globally address those by saying that we will repost a list of resources for negotiation and mediation books in the chat. But all of the trainings, of course, that we lead in both of those areas. just because I know there are a number of folks for whom this might be their first discussion around mediation or negotiation. The program on negotiation has lots of free info, and we'll get our event staff to post that in the chat in just a second. So another question that we have is there a role for mindfulness, David?
Oh,
In preparing questions, I kind of think, knowing you a little bit, that I know the answer, but I'm sure that everyone else would be very interested in that.
yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Absolutely. And there are a lot of mediators who do a little ritual before they go into mediation, whether it's meditation. One mediator told me that she uses the St. Francis prayer, Lord, let me be an instrument of thy peace. Other people use other techniques to get themselves grounded and centered. I think that one of the challenges is when you're in the mediation itself, how to maintain mindfulness. And I think one of the lessons that mindfulness meditation teaches us is how to notice distracting thoughts and uh, get those thoughts to step back, to disengage from those thoughts. It's obviously part of the human condition, whether we're meditating or we're mediating, that we have intrusive thoughts like, is it lunchtime yet? Or do I have something on my calendar after this meeting? These are distractions, and mindfulness can help us uh, avoid being distracted by those intrusive thoughts when they come up. And I think one of the most intrusive thoughts that happens for us mediators are feelings of judgment about the parties. We feel like, oh, this person has read Getting to Yes. They're going to make my life a lot easier today than this other person who clearly hasn't read Getting to Yes, or if they read it, they didn't understand it, because this person is going to make my day much more difficult. And so we have to monitor those feelings of partiality and just separate them and become present, open our hearts and open our minds to folks, and understand that behind whatever kinds of challenging ways in which they present lie challenges that they're dealing with. They're behaving in the way they're behaving because of difficulties they've had in their own life, perhaps. And I want my heart to be open to that as much as it can be.
Yeah, lovely, lovely. Thank you for that. We have a question from Naomi, and I'm scrolling because now we have so many questions that I have to, if I go away, I can't see the right one, which is you're talking a lot about the roles of questions in mediation. Do you make any distinction, David, between the roles of questions for mediators and parties? Because parties can also ask their own questions. Is there a way to think about this differently? And should you prepare differently if you were the person mediating or if you were a party? Are there lines that need to be drawn, for example?
Yeah. So one of the, if I'm interpreting the question correctly, it has to do with creating space for the parties to ask each other questions, or ask, for that matter, ask me questions. And obviously, I do want to create that space. Sometimes people feel a little intimidated by the role of the mediator. You have a law degree, maybe they don't, or you have a lot of years of experience, and they feel deferential and may be reluctant to ask questions. They may be reluctant to ask questions because they fear of each other, because they fear if they ask the question that they're going to be antagonizing the other person. So I think we have to be thoughtful about how we create a safe space for them to have a difficult conversation, including asking each other difficult questions. But one of the interventions that I use as a mediator that I think can be very helpful and I think is responsive to this question is often people in mediation will direct their comments toward me. And I'll sometimes say to them, I wonder if you could say that directly to the person across the table, or that question that you just posed, ask it directly to them. Would you be comfortable doing that? And I find mostly they are. And it creates a whole different dynamic. It creates a much more personal, connected dynamic when they're talking to each other.
Mm-hmm. Great. David, we have a number of people asking about how to take into account cross-cultural dimensions when approaching questions, and possibly cultures in which asking questions and politeness have certain values. And I know it's, tough to treat this in the absence of talking about which cultures, et cetera, but do you have any thoughts about how to approach question asking, thoughtfully in respect to differences that may be apparent?
Yeah. So I have experienced those cultural differences. In fact, I've had the experience of giving a lecture to a group of students from a culture in which it was considered rude to ask the professor a question. It's like, even if the question was coming from curiosity, it felt like you were, I don't know, disrespecting the professor in some way. And I found that awkward because I really like questions and dialogue. Um, but in the mediation room, for example, when there are cultural differences, there may be certain kinds of conversations that are just easier to have in caucus session because you're afraid people are going to be pushing each other's buttons. And indeed, even in the caucus session, when there are cultural differences between me, the person that I'm talking to, I may be crossing a boundary or creating a feeling of affront that I wasn't aware of. And that's why being kind of getting our emotional cues very sensitive, noticing the body language, seeing if we're creating some resistance or discomfort by our question, and why that diversity question, what would it be helpful for me to know about you and about this dispute, about the situation? And filling in the blank of that question might have lots to do with culture and class and ethnicity, race, religion, and those kinds of identity factors, or it may have nothing to do with that. And we just don't know. And we shouldn't make assumptions that just because we have certain obvious or non-obvious differences, that that there's going to be that's going to be a salient issue in this particular negotiation. It might be, it might not be.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. A question that I like because it's for the practitioners. Is there a question, David, that you have as your go-to if you ever draw a blank in the middle of a mediation, which can happen to anybody, right? Do you have
Yes.
a surefire tip to give to somebody of something that you can ask to give you a second to recover?
Yes. And that question is, what question am I not asking that I should be asking? Or what question would you be asking if you were sitting in my chair?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That is really great. Thank you. David, this is a question that's not about questions, but we have so many people here who are clearly very interested in becoming mediators and wondering if it's possible to do so if they are not already lawyers. I'm sure that the answer to that question depends on where you live and regulations. But given, I know that's not our topic today, but given that you're very passionate about this, I would love for you to address for people who are thinking about making a career out of mediation.
Yeah, I want to say to folks who feel like, gee, maybe I should let lawyers be the mediators. If you look at the field of environmental mediation, you'll find that there are a ton of mediators, perhaps the majority, who are not lawyers. If you look at the field of divorce mediation, you'll find a huge cohort of people who come from the background in therapy or other social science fields who are not lawyers. If you look at labor management mediation, you'll find lots of people who majored in labor relations, didn't go to law school. Now, I agree with your point, Nicole. It depends on the laws and regulations of your jurisdiction. But here in the United States, we have a huge group of community mediators, the vast majority of whom are not lawyers. This field needs people from all backgrounds. So I encourage people to consider being a mediator, whether it becomes your day job or something you do on the side as part of your pro bono or charitable work.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you so much, David. And if you participants would like to learn more from David directly, he teaches in the Harvard Mediation Intensive that we run twice a year now. So for people who either are already mediators or want to get further down that path, that is a live in-person course that we hold here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I could spend all afternoon with the questions that have been driven up. We will put David's email address one more time in the chat. And of course, it will be available on our website in case you have further questions for David Hoffman. Again, the recording of this event will be up in a couple of days, as well as the PowerPoint presentation. We had almost 1,000 people join us today from all over the world. It has been a real pleasure. We are wishing everyone a very happy start to the summer, at least in this hemisphere, and hopefully some relaxing time. Our next event to kick off school is with PON's faculty chair, Professor Guhan Subramanian, on September 10th about his new book, Deals. So thank you to everyone. A big thank you to David Hoffman, who is gracious and insightful as ever, and we wish everyone a very wonderful rest of their day. Thank you and be well.